A week after my critical response to Dr. Peterson's video, I Love Great Britain, Dr. Peterson published a video with Ben Shapiro, again lambasting transgender rights. He responded to my argument against him that what he did in 2017 was a red herring, a logical fallacy denoting the distracting away from the central issue of the bill. He believed that it had to do with free speech when, in fact, it had to do with human rights.
As I'm concerned, or that's peripheral in some sense. So the accusation, why do you care? Fair enough. It's like, you know, in some way, people can go to hell in a handbasket if they're inclined to. Mm-hmm. Now, I would rather have that not happen, but people are, what would you say, doomed to their own autonomy. But I'm not saying words that other people want me to say. And the idea of compelled speech, it's like, the bill was this much about gender.
Right.
And it was this much about,
right.
Oh yeah, the government's going to tell me what to say, hey.
But
now they're regulating what therapists can say, therapy sessions.
I say first that Peterson has this idea that by speaking against the bill or any issue that he finds objectionable, he prevents things from going to hell in a handbasket. That is far from clear, and research indicates that he's doing the opposite. Professor Barbara Walters reported recently in a CNN interview that America is close to civil war, and the two causes are, number one, a partial democracy, and number two, ethnic entrepreneurs using group identities to gain political power.
International Relations at the School of Global Policy and Strategy at the University of California, San Diego. She joins me now, and I'm delighted. I mean, when we look at the research, it's frankly frightening, and you conclude that the US is, quote, closer to civil war than any of us would like to believe. How close?
Well, I've been studying civil wars for the last 30 years across the globe. And in fact, the last 4 years, I've been on a task force run by the CIA that tries to predict where outside the United States a civil war, political violence, and instability is likely to break out. And we actually know now that the two best predictors of whether violence is likely to happen are whether a country is an anocracy, and that's a fancy term for a partial democracy, and whether ethnic entrepreneurs have emerged in a country that are using racial, religious, or ethnic divisions to try to gain political power. And the amazing thing about the United States is that both of these factors currently exist, and they have emerged at a surprisingly fast rate.
What's remarkable is the research isn't based on sentiment. It's based on metrics and markers and signs and facts that the US uses to determine the state of other countries' democracies and proximity to upheaval.
Ethnic entrepreneurs here are defined as someone from the dominant ethnic group to which Peterson and Trump belong. If Professor Walters' data holds, and we have every reason to believe that it does because American intelligence deploys her work to watch for pending civil wars across the globe, what Peterson is doing is inciting civil conflict by intensifying political divides. He's not at all resolving it, but adding fuel to the fire. And there's no question that Peterson gained a lot of political power through this maneuver, and he'll continue to do it until he is held to account, which, if the bill did whatever he believed it does, would have long taken place. Regarding why Peterson fundamentally misunderstood the bill, influencers have widely made videos debunking the myths he created.
In fact, due to Peterson's misrepresentation of the bill, the Canadian Bar Association, which is the most trusted legal body in all of Canada, actually had to come out and write a letter debunking the things Peterson was claiming. This is from the Canadian Bar Association, and they said, recently the debate has turned to whether the amendments will force individuals to embrace concepts which they find objectionable. This is a misunderstanding of human rights and hate crimes legislation. For hate crimes, Bill C-16 adds gender identity and expression to the identifiable groups protected from those who advocate genocide, publicly incite hatred likely to lead to a breach of the peace, or willfully promote hatred against them. The Supreme Court of Canada found subsection 319(2), willful promotion of hatred, to be a narrowly confined offense, which suffers from neither overbreadth nor vagueness. The provision possesses a stringent mens rea requirement, necessitating either an intent to promote hatred or knowledge of the substantial certainty of such, and is also strongly supported by the conclusion that the meaning of the word hatred is restricted to the most severe and deeply felt form of opprobrium. They also went on to explain, for those compelled to speak and act in truth, however unpopular, truth is included in those defenses. Nothing in the section compels the use or avoidance of particular words in the public as long as they are not used in their most extreme manifestations with the intention of promoting the level of abhorrence and delegitimization and rejection that produces feelings of hatred against identifiable groups. Those concerned that they could be criminalized for the repugnant or offensive ideas fail to understand a crucial distinction in the law, as the Supreme Court of Canada has explained. So basically, according to the legal experts in Canada, they are not compelling you to say anything. So no, this is not compelled speech. They are not forcing you to say pronouns if you don't want to, and you would not be fined in jail simply for accidentally mislabeling somebody. And here's the craziest part. These laws have already been on the books in all of Canada for years. In fact, where Jordan Peterson lives, this law has already been on the book for 5 years. See, Canada has territories which are similar to states in the United States. And in every one of these territories, this was already the law. All Bill C-16 did was make it federally the law. These same exact statutes have been on the books in Ontario, Canada, where Jordan Peterson lives and teaches, for 5 years now. And not once in 5 years has anybody been affected the way Jordan Peterson claims they would be. In fact, it has already been the law in certain parts of Canada for 15 years, and not one single person's speech has been compelled to call a transgender person anything against their will. And this law has already been federally in place in all of Canada for over a year. Once again, not a single person treated the way Jordan Peterson claimed they would be. Clearly, the facts suggest that this is not the imminent problem Jordan Peterson claimed it was. According to the most trusted legal body in Canada, he misrepresented this entire issue. And he did it in order to paint himself as a victim. He basically came out, misrepresented the law, and then played the victim like somebody was trying to force him to do something that no one was actually trying to force him to do. Once again, the law had already been in effect for 5 years where he lived, and it had never affected him in any way whatsoever. But suddenly he saw an opportunity to put himself in the spotlight, to paint himself as the victim, a hero who's going to stand up against these evil lefties. So then he went public and started saying if the law was passed, he was not going to obey this law. He was going to break the law. So obviously this freaked out the lawyers at the school he worked at. As you can imagine, makes perfect sense. One of your employees stands up and says they're going to disobey a law. If somebody sues him because he disobeyed that law, the whole school could be on the hook for it. So the school sent him a letter that basically said, we respect your free speech, but we're not with you on this one. Just to give themselves a little breathing room in case there was a lawsuit. But of course, Peterson and all these skeptic channels used this as proof that Peterson was being targeted for his free speech, that all these evil SJWs were trying to get him fired for no other reason than he was speaking out against an injustice they were trying to push upon him. But that's not actually what happened at all. He was simply painting himself as the victim here. So, as you might can imagine, as Peterson went out and misrepresented what this law does to his mostly conservative audience, it created a backlash against transgender people. You can prove this to yourself by simply going to Twitter search and searching Bill C-16 and trans or Bill C-16 and transgender and look through the messages over the last year and a half and see just how much hate has been pushed on transgender people because of this. And it didn't just happen on Twitter either. It happened on YouTube. It happened on message boards, all of Reddit. Dr. Jordan Peterson's misrepresentation had a direct negative effect.
Discriminatory speech, but rather promoting genocide, which is a little bit different. At this point, I should also note that this hasn't just been my lay interpretation of the bill, but in fact the views of the head of the Canadian Bar Association, who has roundly debunked Peterson's claims in a letter that I'll link to in the description. With that said, opponents of the bill aren't actually criticizing what is in the bill itself, but rather what isn't. For this, I'll be turning to the analysis of Jared Brown, who testified along with Peterson at the Senate hearing for the bill. Brown's problem with the bill is that definitions of words like harassment and discrimination are left fairly open-ended. This makes sense since it wouldn't be possible for the bill to list every conceivable form of discrimination or harassment, so instead, definitions are left fairly open-ended so that they can be judged on a case-by-case basis. Brown's argument, however, is that because the law is fairly open to interpretation, it will therefore be applied in the most extreme and illiberal way conceivable. In essence, Brown and Peterson's problem with the bill isn't that it does legislate compelled speech, but rather that it could. This isn't a totally baseless critique. The open-endedness and relative lack of transparency of the Human Rights Act is a reasonable thing to be skeptical of. But this skepticism is pretty different from the way that Peterson, Brown, and the like have been insisting that...
You'll find the links to these videos in the description below. But it shows that Peterson grossly exaggerated the bill and caused tremendous harm to the trans community. It strikes me as shocking, as somebody who's worked for him for 4 years, that he would come out to speak about something that he has no grasp on. Gender studies was not an object that we actually had any focus whatsoever. He categorically rejects whole fields of academic disciplines like gender studies and humanities. It's a problem. It's a problem from a secular perspective. It's a problem for me as a Jew from a Jewish perspective. Because Jewish law intersects with all areas of life, most pronouncedly and most relevantly in recent times, medicine. Regarding health and disease issues, we have to listen to doctors. Jews have to listen to doctors. You can ask 3 doctors on matters regarding, for example, whether to take the vaccine or wear a mask. But after you ask them, you have to defer to these doctors' opinions. When there is a doubt regarding the validity of a medical statement, for example, whether it's safe to vaccinate, rabbis rely on the consensus of experts in the field. In scientific conferences, they are full of unique opinions. But it wasn't until Peterson and his intellectual dark web friends that academics learned that they could influence the public without being held to any academic standards. This generally means a rapid descent into conspiracy theories, pseudoscience, and ironically intellectual stagnation because they ignore a large body of existing literature. Peterson makes the accusation that the intent of these bills were driven by Marxist ideologies. I have to ask him, what intent? I didn't know that Peterson was a mind reader. I have to confess that his views echo that of mine while working under him, but never was I so paranoid. I wrote him many letters about how closed-minded I thought feminist activists were. Standing up against them was one of the main drivers of doing the work. Even now, as I'm going back to college, I was called a transphobe on campus because somebody found out that I did biological sex research with Peterson. But is the issue really ideology? Maybe it's more pragmatic. Trans people are people who are disproportionately excluded from all areas of life, including employment, housing, and social life. They're one of the most physically and sexually assaulted groups, suffering from one of the highest rates of suicide and self-harm. Some say up to 50% have attempted suicide. Many of them suffer from trauma and ongoing discrimination. When the trans woman in my school was acting unreasonably towards me, she was probably doing it from a position of extreme vulnerability. Peterson fundamentally doesn't understand what is going on in the lived experiences of trans and LGBTQ people. He doesn't understand the world outside of the Western androcentric one that he inhabits. He's rejected the feminine, which is the future. I would encourage Peterson and his fans to dissociate from their own ideological baggage and learn what trans people go through, and also what terms like microaggression and toxic masculinity really means before criticizing a field of inquiry that they have no acquaintanceship with, much less initiation into. The reason why I make these videos now is because for some people, a word can send them over the edge into suicide. And I can't really imagine the harm that what he did has caused. I don't have an acquaintanceship with. I don't know about it. But I imagine it's out there. And I sorely want it to be improved. I sorely want this to be corrected. So please help me to do that.